A struggling single dad fixes a stranger's car on a freezing morning, only to discover she's a billionaire who's about to offer him a deal that could rewrite their futures. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The cold had settled in overnight, leaving a thin crust of frost on the windows and a bite in the morning air that made Daniel Carter's bones ache. He stood in the kitchen of their modest two-bedroom house, pouring coffee into a chipped thermos while the toaster sputtered to life. The scent of burnt bread filled the air, a familiar failure he didn't have time to fix. From the hallway came the rapid thump of little feet, followed by Emily's voice, bright and breathless. "Dad, I can't find my other boot." Daniel took a deep breath, fighting the urge to let the frustration show. "Check under the couch," he called, screwing on the thermos cap. "That's where the last one ended up." "I did already," she shouted back. Daniel grabbed her backpack, slinging it over his shoulder as he moved toward the living room. Sure enough, one muddy boot was wedged between the wall and the couch leg. He yanked it free just as Emily appeared, hair a wild halo of curls, and cheeks flushed with the energy only 7-year-olds possess at 7:30 in the morning. He knelt to help her into the boot, his fingers stiff from the cold. "Gloves, scarf, lunchbox?" he asked. She nodded, ticking each item off with little pats to her coat pockets and backpack. "All right then," Daniel said, rising with a groan. "Let's hit it." Outside, the old sedan wheezed to life after 2 attempts. The dashboard lights flickered like they were unsure if they wanted to cooperate. Daniel squinted at the fuel gauge, just above E. Again. He exhaled through his nose and tapped the gauge as if that might magically change its mind. "I thought we got gas yesterday," Emily said from the back seat, hugging her knees. "We did," Daniel replied. "Just not a lot." They pulled out of the driveway in silence, the heater blowing lukewarm air as Maple Ridge slowly came to life around them. Storefronts still dark, sidewalks empty, the world wrapped in quiet frost. Daniel glanced at his daughter in the mirror, bright-eyed, bundled, trusting. He tightened his grip on the wheel. They were cutting it close again, in more ways than one, but they'd make it. Somehow, they always did. The road stretched ahead, blanketed in a thin layer of slush that reflected the gray sky like dull glass. Daniel drove carefully, hands tight on the wheel, windshield wipers dragging back and forth with tired effort. Emily sat in the back seat, humming softly to herself, her nose pressed against the window as they crept along the outer edge of town. That's when he saw it, hazard lights blinking through the mist like a signal flare. A white car, sleek and unfamiliar, sat awkwardly angled on the shoulder. Definitely not a local's ride. Daniel slowed instinctively, squinting through the frost-streaked glass. The car looked expensive, foreign-made, low to the ground, like something you'd see in a luxury showroom, not stranded beside a crumbling Midwestern highway. "Is she stuck?" Emily asked, leaning forward. "Looks like it," Daniel muttered, already easing the car over. The woman stood outside the vehicle, her coat too thin for the sharp cold, phone clutched to her ear as she paced in short, agitated strides. Her hair was pulled back neatly, but strands whipped across her face in the wind. She looked polished, out of place, like she'd taken a wrong turn on her way to somewhere far more glamorous. Daniel parked a few feet behind her and stepped out. The cold hit immediately, biting through his worn jacket. "You all right?" he called over the wind. She turned, startled, then lowered her phone. No, my car just died. Roadside assistance says they're backed up. An hour at least." Daniel walked closer, eyes on the vehicle. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Please, I'm Susan." "Daniel," he replied, offering a gloved hand. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The hood opened with a hiss of cold steam, the engine already beginning to freeze in the winter air. Daniel leaned in, the hum of the highway fading as he focused on the machinery. Fancy car, but even expensive things break. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Susan glance toward his car, where Emily waved shyly from the back seat. Something softened in her face. "Is that your daughter?" Daniel nodded without looking up. "Yep, she's used to pit stops." Susan smiled faintly. "You're kind to stop." Daniel shrugged. "Wouldn't sit right to just pass by?" He didn't know it yet, but this small gesture, a stop on a frozen morning, was about to crack open a door neither of them knew they needed. The engine purred softly, a far cry from the sputtering silence it had offered just 20 minutes earlier. Daniel straightened from under the hood, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been white, but now bore the years of labor it had endured. Cold stung his fingers, but he barely noticed. The work had been simple, a loose connector, just as he'd suspected. A 5-minute fix, maybe 10 if you were cautious. For all the car's shine and luxury, it was still just metal, wires, and timing. Machines didn't care how expensive they looked. Susan stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him with a look that didn't quite match her polished exterior. Curiosity, maybe. Something more complicated than simple gratitude. "Try it now," Daniel said, stepping back and giving the hood a solid thump before lowering it. She slid behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine came to life on the first try, smooth and effortless. She looked up at him through the windshield, surprise flickering across her face. He gave her a thumbs up and started heading back to his own car. The door opened behind him. "Wait," she called, stepping out and reaching into her coat pocket. "Let me pay you for your time." Daniel paused, glancing over his shoulder. "That's all right," he said, brushing snow from his jacket. "Didn't take much. But still, you helped me, and I can afford to... I didn't do it for money," he said simply, turning to face her fully. "You needed help. I could help. That's it." She blinked, like she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. People don't usually say no to money, especially in weather like this. Daniel smiled faintly, a tired, sincere curve of his lips. That doesn't mean they shouldn't. Susan looked at him, really looked. This man in a worn coat, with calloused hands and kind eyes, standing in the freezing cold, with no expectation of anything in return. For a long second she didn't say anything. "Thank you," she said finally, quietly. He nodded. "Drive safe." As she pulled away, her taillights glowing dimly through the snow, Daniel returned to his car. Emily was watching him with a curious tilt to her head. "Did she give you anything?" she asked. "Nope," Daniel said, starting the engine. "Didn't want anything." But still something lingered in his chest. Not pride, not regret, just a strange warmth he couldn't name. Daniel had just buckled Emily back into the car when he heard the crunch of boots behind him. He turned to see Susan walking toward him, her breath rising in soft white clouds, the sleek sports car idling quietly behind her. "Hey," she said, hesitating for a moment before slipping her phone out of her coat pocket. "Can I get your number?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Susan gave a small laugh, like even she wasn't sure. "To say thank you properly. Or in case, I don't know, something comes up with the car again. You clearly know your way around engines." He studied her for a moment, her sharp features softened by the cold, her perfectly tailored coat dusted with snow. She didn't seem the type to ask for help twice, and definitely not the type to linger in places like this. He glanced back at Emily, who was now busy drawing fog hearts on the window. "I don't think you'll need it," he said finally, not unkindly. "Connector was just loose. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." Susan smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Still, I'd feel better having it." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he said, reciting the number slowly while she typed it in. "But I'm not a business, no answering machines, just me." "That's kind of the point," she said. He tilted his head. "You always collect numbers from strangers who fix your car?" She grinned, and this time it reached all the way. "Only the decent ones." He let out a soft chuckle. "Well, don't hold your breath. Maple Ridge isn't exactly full of guys like me." Susan looked at him for a beat longer than felt normal. Then she nodded, slid her phone back into her pocket, and started to turn away. "Thanks again, Daniel. Really." Take care, Susan." He watched her walk back to the car and slide in smoothly behind the wheel. Moments later, the Phantom eased back onto the road, tires whispering against the wet pavement. Daniel climbed into his own car, blowing into his hands to warm them. Emily was still drawing. "Is she going to call you?" she asked without looking up. "Nah," Daniel said, pulling back onto the road. "Probably won't see her again." But part of him, some small, quiet part, wasn't entirely sure. The road stretched quiet and gray ahead, the kind of stillness that settled over Maple Ridge when the morning rush thinned and the sun hadn't yet bothered to break through the clouds. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the heater vent as lukewarm air hummed from the dashboard. Emily had nodded off in the back seat, her head tilted awkwardly against the window, mouth slightly open, her little mittened hands folded in her lap. But Daniel's thoughts weren't on the road, or the school drop-off they were now late for, or even the work waiting back at the garage. They were stuck on her. Susan. He hadn't meant to remember her name, but it clung to the corners of his mind like snow that wouldn't melt. Her voice still echoed there, soft but clear. Her expression, controlled but not cold, had lingered with him long after she'd driven off. She was grateful, sure, polite. But there had been something else behind her eyes, something unspoken. Not sadness exactly, not fear, it was weight. Like she was carrying something heavy, but pretending it didn't exist. Daniel had seen that look before. In the mirror, after Hannah died. In the faces of customers who came in pretending they weren't one bad paycheck away from losing their car, and everything else with it. It was the look of someone used to keeping the world at arm's length. And yet, she'd asked for his number. He shook his head, pressing his fingers to the steering wheel. It didn't matter. She was gone, probably already halfway to some high-rise meeting with people who wore suits and used words like portfolio and synergy. He was just a guy who fixed her car. Still, the feeling remained. Not attraction, exactly. It was deeper than that. A strange pull, like he'd stepped into a conversation halfway through, but couldn't stop listening. Something about her made sense, even if none of it should have. At the next stoplight, Daniel glanced at the rearview mirror. Emily stirred but didn't wake. The world was still cold, still gray. But Susan's eyes stayed with him, quiet, complicated. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that unsettled him more than he liked. The bell above the garage door jangled weakly as Daniel pushed it open, the metal frame groaning against the chill. The place smelled like it always did, burnt oil, rubber, and the faint tang of old coffee that had been left too long on the burner. Harrison's garage was a far cry from the polished dealerships across town, but it was his, for now. He flipped on the lights, their flicker stuttering across the concrete floor, revealing a few cars in various states of disrepair. A busted-out Civic with a dented hood, an old Ford pickup with a cracked radiator. Nothing glamorous, just problems waiting to be solved. He hung his coat on the wall hook and made his way to the office in the back, where a stack of unopened mail greeted him like a silent, unpaid army. He thumbed through them. Electricity, water, rent, each envelope thinner than his patience, thicker than his wallet could handle. He sighed, rubbing at the back of his neck, as he sank into the worn swivel chair. The numbers didn't lie. They never did. Even working 6 days a week, even skipping dinner some nights and patching things up instead of replacing them, he was always just barely making it. One emergency away from things tipping too far. The sound of humming pulled him out of his spiral. Emily sat cross-legged in the corner of the office on a flattened cardboard box, colored pencils scattered around her like a burst of confetti. Her tongue peeked out slightly in concentration as she filled in the yellow hair of a princess wearing a crown that looked suspiciously like a spark plug. He leaned over her shoulder. "What are you working on?" "A castle," she said brightly, turning the paper toward him. "And that's you." She pointed to a caped figure beside the princess. "You're the superhero mechanic who saves people." Daniel chuckled, his chest aching in that way only love could cause. "Superhero, huh? Do I get any special powers? She nodded seriously. You can fix anything. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. If only that were true. If only a wrench and some elbow grease could fix overdue rent, dwindling hope, and the way the world seemed to forget the people who kept it running. But for now, he had a castle drawn in crayon and a daughter who believed in him. And that would have to be enough. The shop had gone quiet for the day. Outside, dusk crept in through the dirty windows, painting the garage in shades of blue and amber. Daniel sat at his workbench, a half-eaten sandwich beside him and an alternator halfway disassembled under his hands. Emily had fallen asleep on the old plaid couch in the corner, wrapped in a fleece blanket with cartoon stars on it, her sketchbook open on her chest. He let out a tired breath, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. Another long day, another handful of customers barely able to pay, and the heater in the office had finally given up with a sputter and a sigh. He'd have to fix that too, eventually. His phone buzzed on the bench, screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. Daniel frowned. Unknown numbers usually meant robocalls or bill collectors, neither of which he was in the mood for. Still, something tugged at him. He picked it up, wiping his hand once more before swiping to answer. Yeah, this is Daniel. A pause. Then a voice, smooth and unmistakable. Hi, it's Susan. He blinked. For a second her face flashed in his mind. The white car, the winter wind in her hair, the way she'd looked at him like he was some kind of mystery. Oh, he said, caught off guard. Did the car give you trouble again? No, she said quickly. It's running fine, thanks to you. There was a pause on her end, just long enough to feel intentional. I wanted to ask you something, she continued. Actually, offer something. Daniel sat back wary. Go on. I inherited a property, she said, an old garage. It belonged to my father. It's in rough shape, and I don't trust just anyone with it. I was hoping you might be interested in taking a look, possibly helping restore it. Daniel stared at the wall, caught between confusion and disbelief. You want me to work on your garage? Yes, she said, I want to hire you. He glanced at Emily, sleeping soundly, her breath soft and steady. And why me? Because you didn't ask for anything, Susan replied, quiet and sure. And I don't meet many people like that. Daniel didn't respond right away. Somewhere deep in his gut, something shifted. This wasn't a thank you, it was an invitation. Daniel stood just inside the shop office, phone still pressed to his ear, as the hum of the overhead lights filled the silence between them. Susan's voice was calm, measured, but there was a thread of vulnerability tucked beneath the polished words. It's not just a repair job, she said. It's a full restoration. The place hasn't been touched in years. I've been meaning to do something with it, but I didn't trust anyone with the project, not until now. Daniel leaned against the counter, the edges of her offer starting to settle in his mind like dust after a long day's work. He wasn't used to people offering him anything, let alone this kind of opportunity, especially not people who drove cars that cost more than his entire house. And you're sure you want me? He asked, not out of modesty, just genuine disbelief. I am, she said without hesitation. The way you fixed my car, how you treated me without knowing who I was, that matters more than a resume. He let out a quiet breath. I'm not one for handouts. This isn't charity, Daniel. I'll pay you. Well, more than well. He glanced around the office. A space heater sat in the corner, dead since last Tuesday. The water stain in the ceiling had grown again after last night's snow. Emily's drawing of the two of them, him in a cape, her holding a wrench, was taped to the wall above his desk. He stared at it now, her crooked handwriting spelling, Daddy fixes everything. How well is well? He asked, cautious. Susan gave a soft laugh. Let's just say it's enough to take care of your shop for a while, and maybe fix a few of those things you've been putting off. He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, but she didn't rush him. Finally he said, Where is it? Just outside Chicago. It's not far. I can send a car if you want to take a look." A beat passed, then, quietly, "Bring Emily. I think she'd like it." Daniel rubbed a hand over his jaw, unsure if he was crazy for even considering it. "All right," he said, "I'll come see it, but I'm not promising anything." "Fair enough," she replied, something warm behind her words. As the call ended, Daniel stared at the phone in his hand. It wasn't a dream. It was a door, one he never expected to open. The next morning, the offer still clung to Daniel like the scent of motor oil, stubborn and hard to shake. He stood by the open garage bay, sipping coffee from a cracked thermos as a thin wind tugged at his flannel jacket. The town was waking up around him, slow and familiar. A dog barked across the street, someone scraped frost off their windshield, and the diner's old neon sign blinked to life like it did every morning, half the letters still burned out. He should have dismissed her offer. A fancy garage outside Chicago, a personal invitation from a woman who, by all logic, should have forgotten him the second her car restarted? It didn't make sense. Daniel Carter didn't belong in the kind of world Susan clearly came from, but she wasn't what he'd expected either. Most rich people he'd met, and there weren't many, talked like kindness was something they loaned out in exchange for credit. Susan hadn't done that. She'd looked him in the eye, had listened, even when he said no. And now she was asking again, but not with pressure or pity, with respect. He glanced at Emily, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the shop, coloring on the back of an invoice with a red crayon that had seen better days. She looked up at him and grinned, proud of whatever messy masterpiece she was working on. "You thinking about that lady again?" she asked. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" "You got your quiet face on," she said, scrunching her nose, "like when you're trying to fix something without knowing where the broken part is." He laughed under his breath. Smart kid. "It's a big decision," he admitted, crouching beside her. "Taking a job that far away, with someone I barely know." "But you do know her," Emily said, as if that settled everything. "Not really." She said thank you. Daniel looked at his daughter for a long moment, then out at the road beyond the bay door. Maybe Susan wasn't like the others. Maybe this wasn't just about money or repairs. Maybe, just maybe, it was a chance. One of those rare ones life handed you without a warning label. He just didn't know yet if he was brave enough to take it. The train station in Maple Ridge was little more than a wind-swept platform with a bench, a vending machine that rarely worked, and a schedule that ran late more often than not. Daniel stood near the edge, Emily at his side, her hand tucked firmly into his. The morning train to Chicago loomed in the distance, a soft rumble beneath the tracks and a mist of frost curling off the steel rails. He hadn't told many people he was leaving, just closed up the shop for a few days, scribbled "back soon" on a torn receipt, and hoped the town wouldn't fall apart without him. Susan's assistant had arranged the tickets. She'd offered to send a car, first class, heated seats, snacks in the back, but Daniel had refused. He didn't need to be chauffeured. He needed to see things for himself, on his terms. When they arrived at the city, Susan was waiting just inside the station, dressed simply this time. Dark jeans, wool coat, her hair tied back. Not flashy, not showy, still very much her. "You came," she said, her smile genuine. Daniel gave a small nod. "Told you I'd look." They drove in her car, which Daniel now recognized as a high-performance masterpiece disguised as a luxury sedan. Emily sat in the back, eyes wide, as she stared at the skyline. The garage wasn't far, a large brick building tucked between two newer developments. The sign above the door had long since faded, letters barely legible, but it had bones, strong ones, the kind that reminded Daniel of something old and worth saving. "This is it," Susan said, unlocking the heavy side door. "My father's shop. He opened it before I was born. Closed it before I finished college." Daniel walked through slowly, taking in the dusty tool benches, the skylights streaked with grime, the rows of old car manuals still stacked on shelves like they were waiting for someone to come home. After a few minutes, he turned to her. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll restore it." Her face lit up, but before she could speak, he added, "On one condition." She stilled. "No favors? No handouts?" "You hire me, you pay me fair, and I do this the right way. I earn it." Susan met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a second. Then she nodded, slow and sure. "Deal." It wasn't charity. It wasn't luck. It was a start, and it would be his. The train rocked gently beneath them, its rhythmic sway soothing in a way Daniel hadn't expected. Chicago unfurled ahead in the distance, its skyline etched against a pale blue sky, glittering through the smudged window like a promise. Emily had her forehead pressed to the glass, wide-eyed, as she pointed out every bridge, billboard, and passing building like each one was a discovery. "Is that a real skyscraper?" she asked, voice full of wonder. Daniel smiled, watching her excitement with quiet amusement. "Sure is. Probably 100 stories." Emily let out a low whistle. "That's like taller than 5 houses." "Maybe even 6. She laughed, kicking her feet beneath the seat, her joy infectious. For a moment Daniel let himself breathe. He hadn't felt it in a while, this strange thing settling in his chest. Not relief, not safety, but something close. Hope. The kind that didn't come with strings or a ticking clock. By the time they stepped off the train, Chicago wrapped around them like a living thing. The air was crisp and fast-moving, the streets pulsing with people and noise, the city buzzing with a kind of energy that made Maple Ridge feel like a still frame in an old movie. Susan met them on the platform, dressed casually again, though nothing about her ever seemed fully unpolished. She smiled at Emily first, then at Daniel. "Welcome," she said simply, like they weren't crossing a chasm between worlds. The drive from the station wound past blocks of brick buildings, neon signs, food trucks, and murals that lit up entire sides of buildings. Emily leaned forward between the seats, trying to take in everything at once. When they arrived at the loft Susan had arranged for their stay, Daniel hesitated on the threshold. It wasn't lavish, modern, clean, with tall windows and hardwood floors, but it was far more than they were used to. More space, more warmth, more possibility. "You sure this isn't too much?" he asked quietly. Susan shook her head. "You're not here as a guest. You're here to build something. You deserve a place that reflects that." Daniel nodded slowly, taking it in. For the first time in years, he wasn't surviving. He was stepping towards something. And this time, it didn't feel like he was walking alone. The old garage stood like a forgotten relic, tucked between a pair of renovated buildings that gleamed with glass and steel. Time had not been kind to it. Faded red bricks were chipped and worn, the windows clouded with grime, and the wooden bay doors sagged on rusted hinges like tired shoulders. A once proud sign above the entrance read, "Sinclair Automotive," though half the letters were missing, and the rest looked like they might fall at any moment. Daniel stepped out of the car, Emily trailing behind him, her boots crunching on a patch of salt-stained snow. He stared at the building in silence, the cold wind tugging at his collar. Susan stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "This is it," she said softly. "My father built this place before I was born, ran it until I was about 10. Daniel didn't say anything right away. He walked forward, slowly pushing open the side entrance. The metal handle was icy in his palm, the door protesting with a long groan. Inside it was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of old oil and forgotten years. Cobwebs laced the corners. Tools hung from pegboards like ghosts of another life. An old office sat in the back, its windows cracked, desk still cluttered with faded receipts and empty coffee cups. One wall had collapsed partially inward, exposing splintered beams and insulation that had long since given up the fight. Emily stayed close to the doorway, eyes wide, her hand curled around Daniel's. He gave it a squeeze, then looked back at Susan. "It's got good bones," he said, "under the dust and decay." She gave a humorless laugh. just like him. Daniel studied her face, tight jaw, distant eyes. "You didn't like your father?" Susan shrugged. "I think I did once, but he had this way of making you feel small, like nothing you did was enough. He poured everything into this place, but not much into being a dad." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood that kind of absence. Not loud, not cruel, just hollow. "So why save it?" he asked gently. She looked around, and for the first time her voice cracked just slightly. "Because this is the only thing he ever really left me. And maybe, if it becomes something good again, I'll stop hating what it meant." Daniel looked around the wreckage, at the silence thick with old tension and buried memories, and then he nodded. "Let's bring it back." Dust swirled in the pale morning light streaming through cracked windows as Daniel set down his tool bag and surveyed the space with fresh eyes. The place was a wreck, sure, but it had promise. He saw through the rot, the warped floorboards, and the rusted-out lift like a sculptor eyeing the shape hidden inside the stone. Susan stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed, blazer too sharp for the setting. She wasn't saying much, but Daniel could feel her watching him, not like a boss, more like someone trying to understand a language they'd only ever read in books. "You don't have to stay," he said, glancing up from the corroded fuse box he was poking through. "There's about a week's worth of dirt and disappointment before it starts looking like progress." Susan offered a tight smile. "I'm fine." He nodded, not pushing it. Everyone had their own way of dealing with ghosts. She drifted around the space, careful not to step on anything unstable, her heels clicking softly across the cracked concrete. Daniel kept working, pulling back layers of old wiring, making mental notes on what could be salvaged. Every now and then he caught her watching him, not just his work, but him, like she was trying to square who he was with what she'd assumed. "You always this quiet when you work?" she asked after a while. Daniel glanced up, a half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Only when someone's hovering." Susan's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprised but not offended. "I'm not hovering." "You're definitely hovering," he said, gently closing the panel, "but it's all right. You're allowed." She stepped closer, just enough to see what he was doing, but not enough to intrude. "I guess I'm used to being the one giving directions." "Yeah, I got that," he said, not unkindly. She was quiet for a moment, eyes on the tangle of wires. "This place meant everything to him," she said softly. "It was his empire. Even when it was falling apart, he treated it like gold." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, considering her words. "Maybe now it can mean something to you too, but it won't happen overnight." She nodded slowly. "I'm not expecting miracles." He gave her a look. "You brought in a mechanic, not a magician." That made her laugh. Unexpected and real. Maybe the space wasn't the only thing starting to open up. Susan didn't expect to find herself sitting cross-legged on the floor of the loft, surrounded by crayons, half-finished drawings, and a very serious 7-year-old with paint on her cheek. But here she was, coat shrugged off, heels abandoned by the door, listening as Emily explained the color-coded layout of her imaginary kingdom. "This is the castle," Emily said, pointing to a large, lopsided rectangle. "That's me in the tower, and that's my dad. He's not a prince, though. He's the mechanic who keeps everything running." Susan smiled. "I like that. Very practical." "He fixes the drawbridge and the dragon cages," Emily added matter-of-factly, coloring in a wobbly sword with an orange crayon. "But he also makes breakfast, sometimes." "Sometimes?" Emily shrugged. "Depends how tired he is." Susan chuckled, surprised by how easy it felt. She'd walked into the loft hoping to drop off some architectural sketches and talk business. Instead, Daniel had stepped out to take a call, and she'd wandered into the living room to find Emily on the floor, humming to herself, completely immersed in a fantasy world of cardboard markers and crayon armor. Now here they were, talking like old friends. "What about your mom?" Susan asked gently, unsure if she was crossing a line. Emily didn't pause. "She died when I was 5, she said simply, like it was just another part of the story. "She was really pretty. Dad says I look like her when I smile. Susan felt something tighten in her chest. She used to paint, Emily continued. Big pictures, like oceans and skies. I don't remember a lot, but I remember her hands. They always smelled like lemon soap and paint. Susan blinked slowly, the weight of those words hitting harder than she'd expected. Emily looked up at her then, eyes round and honest. Do you miss anybody? Susan hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I do. Emily studied her for a moment, then slid a crayon across the floor. You can help with the flags if you want. They're the hardest part. Susan picked up the crayon, settled into the drawing, and for the first time in what felt like years, let herself be part of someone else's world. No meetings, no walls, just a little girl with too much wisdom and the kind of honesty that left no room for pretending. The scent of roasted chicken and garlic filled the loft, warm and comforting in a way that made the place feel less like a temporary stay and more like home. The kitchen was modest, but Daniel had made do, he always did. A few simple ingredients, an old cast-iron pan, and somehow he'd pulled off a meal that smelled like a Sunday dinner. They sat at the small wooden table by the window, a city skyline glowing just beyond the glass, flickering with 1,000 lights that felt distant and dreamy. Emily had set the table herself, mismatched napkins, water in wine glasses, and a flower she'd plucked from the park earlier that day, sitting in a chipped mug like it belonged in a vase. Daniel carved the chicken while Susan passed the breadbasket, their motions easy, natural. No scripts, no expectations. Emily giggled as she took a bite of her roll. Dad burned this last time twice. Daniel gave her a playful glare. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Susan smiled, watching the exchange. Well, it's perfect tonight. Daniel glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. I'll add it to my resume. Mechanic/dinner magician. They ate slowly, not out of politeness, but out of comfort. The clink of cutlery, the low hum of city life through the window, and the occasional burst of Emily's stories filled the air. Susan listened as Emily described her latest drawing project, a map of their imaginary kingdom, complete with dragon stables, candy fields, and a library guarded by a sleepy lion. Daniel chimed in occasionally, usually with a sarcastic twist or a gentle tease that made Emily groan and Susan laugh. It felt simple, easy, normal. At one point, Susan leaned back and looked between them, Daniel reaching to refill Emily's glass, Emily tucking into a piece of chicken with sauce on her chin. She felt something stir in her chest, a warmth she hadn't invited, hadn't planned for. And Daniel, catching her watching, held her gaze just long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. No one said it aloud, but in the quiet, in the laughter, in the ease, they all felt it. Something here was beginning to matter. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket up to her chin and a book slipping from her fingers, Daniel stepped onto the balcony with a mug of coffee. The city stretched out before him. Quiet now, the rush of traffic softened into background noise, lights twinkling like they were trying to outshine the stars. Susan joined him a moment later, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. She stood beside him without speaking at first, just watching the skyline like it held answers she hadn't yet figured out how to ask for. I used to think I hated this city, she said finally, voice quiet. But now I think I just hated how small I felt in it. Daniel didn't say anything. He took a sip of coffee, let the silence breathe. My father loved it, she continued. Chicago was where he could be important, respected, feared even. She gave a small, bitter smile. He was a brilliant mechanic. People talk about him like he was a legend, but he wasn't much of a father. Daniel leaned against the railing. What happened? She shrugged. He built Sinclair Automotive from nothing. Ran it like a kingdom, tight, cold, efficient. I used to sit in that garage on weekends thinking maybe if I learned enough, he'd see me. I memorized part numbers, learned to spot a cracked gasket from 10 feet away. But it didn't matter. To him, I was the kid with soft hands and too many questions. Daniel watched her quietly, the weight in her voice familiar. He didn't trust people, she said. Never had employees longer than a few months. Thought everyone was out to take something from him. The business was his. And he made sure I knew I'd never really earn a place in it. But you inherited it, Daniel said. Susan gave a humorless laugh. Only because he didn't have anyone else. They stood in silence for a moment, the night thick with everything unsaid. Daniel looked at her, really looked, and saw not the polished woman in expensive clothes, but the little girl still trying to prove herself to a man long gone. "You're not him," he said simply. Her eyes flicked to his, startled for a second, then softened. "No," she said, "I'm not." And for the first time it sounded like she believed it. The garage smelled like dust and old dreams, even as new life slowly crept in with every wire reconnected and beam reinforced. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow, crouched beneath the shell of what used to be a beautiful Mustang. It was nearly midnight, but neither he nor Susan seemed in a hurry to call it quits. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a warm glow that made the place feel less broken. Susan sat on an overturned milk crate nearby, sleeves rolled up, grease smudged across one wrist. She wasn't pretending anymore, not trying to supervise, not keeping a professional distance, just there, present. Daniel slid out from under the car, stretching his back with a groan. "Remind me why I agreed to this again," he muttered. Susan smirked, handing him a bottle of water. "Because you're stubborn and a little too proud for your own good." He chuckled, taking the bottle. "Fair." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the hum of the city leaking in through the broken windows. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Inside, it was just the two of them, and the low thrum of shared exhaustion. "I haven't worked this hard since college," Susan said, looking at her hands. "Didn't think I'd find myself elbow-deep in engine grease again." Daniel glanced over. "You ever actually work in a shop?" "Only when my father was in a decent mood, which wasn't often," she said. "But I liked it. The order of it. Machines make sense. People don't." He nodded. "Machines don't lie." Susan looked at him, her expression softer now. "Neither do you." He didn't know what to say to that. Praise always made him uneasy. But her voice wasn't full of admiration. It was full of understanding. "You miss her?" she asked, nodding toward the photo on his toolbox. Hannah, caught in a candid moment, laughing mid-sentence, hair wild in the wind. "Every day," he said quietly. "But it's different now. The sharp edges dull over time. Emily, she brings back the light." Susan looked down, brushing dust from her knee. "You're a good father, Daniel." He shrugged, not to deflect, but because it was the only thing that mattered. "I just show up. Every day. That's half the job." She smiled. "That's the hardest part." The distance between them had been shrinking for days, but tonight it felt nearly gone, replaced by something quieter. Not quite romance. Not yet. Just two people, working side by side, slowly learning how to trust again. And in the stillness of the garage, that felt like enough. It started with balloons. Daniel came back from the hardware store late in the afternoon, hands full of wiring and replacement parts, expecting to find Emily doodling in the corner of the garage like she always did. Instead, he found her standing in the middle of the loft, eyes wide, mouth open, surrounded by streamers, gifts, and a cake big enough to feed 20. "Susan did it," Emily whispered, like saying it too loud might make it disappear. The walls were lined with decorations in every color of the rainbow. A paper banner hung crookedly over the window. "Happy 8th birthday, Emily." Cartoon dragons, castles, and glittering stars were taped to every surface. On the kitchen table, wrapped gifts were stacked beside a spread of cupcakes, snacks, and a cake shaped, somehow, like a toolbox. Daniel stopped in the doorway, completely still. Susan appeared from the hallway, a little flower on her cheek, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked almost nervous. "Surprise?" He blinked. "It's not her birthday." "It is, actually," Susan said gently. "She told me 2 days ago. Said you didn't want to make a fuss this year." Daniel looked at Emily. Her eyes were shining, caught between disbelief and unfiltered joy. "I didn't want to make a fuss because I couldn't," he murmured. Susan's voice softened. "You do everything, Daniel. I thought maybe this time someone else could." He didn't know what to say. Gratitude tangled with something sharper in his chest. This wasn't just a cake and a few decorations. It was thoughtful, personal. Too much, maybe, but also exactly what Emily deserved, and that, more than anything, unraveled him. "Dad, there's a bouncy castle on the roof," Emily shouted, spinning in place. "There's not," Susan said quickly, laughing. "But I did get her a piñata." Emily darted off to explore her new kingdom of party favors and surprises. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, trying to find his balance. "I didn't mean to step on your toes," Susan added. She's special, and no kid should feel like their birthday doesn't matter." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not a billionaire, not a businesswoman, but someone who cared, deeply, messily, unexpectedly. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "She'll remember this." Susan smiled. Good. That was the point. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel like the only one holding everything together. The garage was quiet again, the kind of late-night stillness that settled in after long hours of work, and just enough laughter to forget how tired you were. Daniel leaned against the workbench, grease on his sleeves, a smudge of dirt on his cheek he hadn't bothered to wipe away. Across from him, Susan stood with her sleeves rolled up and her hair falling loose from the ponytail she'd tried to keep intact all evening. They'd spent the last few hours rewiring the overhead light system together, something Susan had insisted on learning herself. She wasn't half bad with a voltage tester, though Daniel had gently steered her away from the live wires more than once. Now the lights above flickered on perfectly, soft, even, warm. Susan looked up at them, hands on her hips. "Well, we didn't burn the place down." Daniel grinned. "Always the goal." She turned to him, her expression open and a little breathless from laughing too hard earlier at her own clumsy attempt to crawl through the attic crawl space. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, nothing between them but the soft hum of the lights they'd just brought back to life. "You ever think about how strange this all is?" she asked. "You, me, here." "All the time," Daniel said, voice low. She stepped a little closer, just a few feet between them now, her arms still folded but her posture softer, curious. Unspoken things hung in the air like dust in the light. "I don't usually let people in," she said. "Not like this." Daniel's breath caught. Neither did he. And then, without warning, she reached up and brushed that smear of grease from his cheek with her thumb, her touch gentle, lingering just long enough to make the space between them feel impossibly charged. His eyes met hers. She didn't look away. He leaned in just slightly, just enough. But then he stopped. The moment hovered. Daniel stepped back, clearing his throat. "We should, lock up for the night. Long day tomorrow." Susan nodded, her expression unreadable now. "Yeah, of course." He turned away, heart pounding, unsure if he'd just done the right thing or walked away from something real. Behind him, she stood still, lips parted just slightly. The moment passed, but it didn't vanish. Daniel didn't see it coming. He was elbow-deep in a transmission rebuild when his phone buzzed on the workbench, twice, then 5 more times in quick succession. At first he ignored it, just another spam text or a missed call from someone trying to sell him extended car warranties. But when the 6th buzz came with a photo from Nate, one of the guys back in Maple Ridge, he finally pulled off his gloves and checked. The photo was a screenshot, a tabloid cover. Under the hood and into her heart, Sinclair heiress spotted cozy with small-town mechanic. Below the headline was a grainy shot, clearly taken from a distance, of him and Susan outside the garage, talking in the fading glow of sunset. He was leaning on the open door of her car. She was laughing. Her hand was resting lightly on his arm. Daniel stared at it, jaw tightening. Another ping, this time from a customer. "Hey man, is this real? That you?" He didn't respond. A soft voice from behind him. "You saw it." He turned. Susan stood in the doorway of the garage, phone still in hand, her expression tight, part frustration, part guilt, part something else. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, not looking at her. "Didn't realize we were headline material." "I didn't either," she said. "It was supposed to be quiet. Some photographer must have followed me after a board meeting yesterday. They've been circling since my father's will went public. They smell money and scandal." He didn't say anything right away, just stared at the wall like it held answers. "I didn't mean for this to affect you," she added. "Well, it did," Daniel said more sharply than he intended. "People in my town are already talking. Emily's school, customers. I can feel it changing already." Susan stepped forward, voice steady. "We haven't done anything wrong." "No," Daniel agreed. "But in your world, perception's louder than truth, and mine doesn't survive gossip well." She flinched. Just slightly. "Enough." "I'll make a statement," she said quickly. "Tell them we're not involved." Daniel met her eyes. "Is that what you want?" She hesitated. That hesitation said more than any headline ever could. The knock came just after noon. Not loud, but confident. The kind that didn't ask permission so much as assume it was already granted. Daniel looked up from the engine bay, brow furrowed. Susan was out running errands with Emily, and the shop was quiet except for the familiar clink of tools and the low hum of the space heater trying its best. He wiped his hands and stepped toward the front door of the garage. When he opened it, the man standing there looked like he'd walked out of a high-end fashion ad. Tailored wool coat, perfect jawline, sunglasses that hadn't seen a scratch, and the kind of smirk that made Daniel's skin bristle before a word was even spoken. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked flatly. "I'm looking for Susan," the man said, pulling off his sunglasses with practiced ease. "I heard she was slumming it out here with a wrench monkey." Daniel blinked once. "You are?" "Grant Whitaker," he said, offering a hand Daniel didn't take. "Susan and I used to be engaged." That earned a beat of silence. "She mentioned you," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "Didn't sound like a fond memory." Grant smiled like a man too used to getting his way. "Well, people remember things how they want. I just thought I'd check in. Make sure she's not making any more impulsive decisions." Daniel's jaw tensed. "She's doing just fine." "Is she?" Grant took a step inside without asking. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's throwing herself into a vanity project with someone who's barely scraping by." Daniel stepped in front of him, calm but firm. "You're not welcome here." Grant gave a small, condescending chuckle. "Look, I get it. You're the rugged, blue-collar hero in this little fantasy she's built. But trust me, the novelty wears off. When she's done playing house with the mechanic, she'll remember where she belongs." Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I'm not interested in your warnings," he said, steady as stone, "and I sure as hell don't need your permission to be here." Grant tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Just don't be surprised when she wakes up." Daniel took a step closer. "You should leave. Now." Grant backed off with a shrug and a smug smile. "Tell her I stopped by." As he walked out, Daniel exhaled slowly, hands flexing at his sides. He didn't care about Grant's money or his opinions. But the words stuck like grit under the skin, because part of him couldn't help but wonder, was the man wrong or just early? The garage was quiet when Susan returned. The lights were still on, the scent of oil and dust hanging in the air, but Daniel wasn't at the workbench. He stood near the back bay, arms crossed, posture stiff. She knew something was off before he even looked up. Emily had fallen asleep in the car, and Susan had gently tucked a blanket over her before coming inside. Whatever this was, it wasn't for little ears. "You saw him," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Grant paid me a visit, walked in here like he owned the place." Susan rubbed her temples. "I didn't know he was in town. He's been circling ever since my father's will made the news. I tried to cut ties. He doesn't take no well." Daniel leaned against the metal table, jaw clenched. He had a lot to say. About me, about you, about this whole setup. Susan sighed. "Let me guess. He thinks you're a distraction. He thinks you're slumming it, that I'm a temporary fix to whatever version of broken he assumes you are." She met his gaze, something sharp flickering behind her calm. "And what do you think, Daniel?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I think I need to understand what this is before it spins into something I can't hold on to." Susan stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "You think I'm using you?" "I think—" He paused, trying to find the words. "I think we've been walking in two different worlds, and for a while it felt like we were building a bridge. But lately, I don't know. Feels like we're just meeting in the middle and hoping it holds." Susan's shoulders fell slightly. "Daniel, I didn't plan any of this. You just happened. And suddenly, I didn't feel so alone in a room full of people anymore." He searched her face. "And what happens when your world comes calling again? When headlines come back? When men like Grant decide they want a piece of your life?" "I tell them no," she said, "like I've been telling them." "And what if that's not enough?" he asked, his voice low. "What if I'm not enough?" Her breath hitched. That was the line. It wasn't about class or money or reputation. It was about trust. About whether they were real beyond this place, this moment. And neither of them had an answer yet. The morning air was thick with something heavier than fog. Daniel moved through the loft like a man packing more than just belongings. He didn't slam drawers or storm around. He was quiet, focused, mechanical. The way he always was when something hurt too much to name. Emily sat on the couch, her backpack clutched in her lap. She didn't understand why they were leaving, not really, but she knew enough not to ask yet. Her eyes followed Daniel's every move, small and wide and waiting. He zipped the duffel shut and gave the place one last look. The sun was just beginning to rise through the tall windows, spilling gold light across the floor, catching on the blueprint still pinned to the wall, the garage plans, the dream, the thing he thought he was building not just with his hands, but with his heart. Susan hadn't come by that morning, not after what they'd said the night before, not after Grant's visit, and not after Daniel had asked the question she didn't know how to answer. He'd waited, hoped. But silence had a way of speaking louder than words. At the front door, he paused, one hand on the knob. That's when it opened. Susan stood there, out of breath, like she'd run the whole block. Her eyes landed on the packed bag, on Emily, on him. "You're leaving," she said, and it wasn't a question. Daniel didn't move. "Yeah?" Just like that. "I thought maybe this was something," he said, his voice low, even. "But it's hard to know where I stand when everything around you is polished and planned, and I'm just a guy who knows how to hold a wrench." Susan stepped forward. "You're more than that." "Then why didn't you say it?" he asked. "When everything went sideways, when the cameras came out and the past came knocking, you froze. And I get it. I do. But I can't keep being the one reaching across the line." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Daniel nodded once. "Didn't think so." He turned to Emily, gently took her hand and walked out, down the hallway, into the elevator, out into the city where the skyline no longer felt like possibility, just distance. He didn't know if she'd chase him, but he knew this. Sometimes love meant staying, and sometimes, when it wasn't returned with the same weight, love meant walking away. The garage was too quiet without him. Susan stood just inside the entrance, arms folded tightly across her chest, as if that could hold back the ache settling deeper with every hour. The place looked cleaner now, more alive than when they'd first walked through weeks ago, tools arranged neatly on the pegboard, fresh wiring snaking along the beams, the old skylights now gleaming with filtered sunlight. It bore Daniel's mark in every corner, quiet craftsmanship, no shortcuts, all heart. And now he was gone. She wandered past the workbench where he used to lean, sipping coffee, giving her that half-smile when she asked too many questions about torque and balance. His toolbox sat closed, the photo of Emily and her crayon castle still pinned to the wall beside it. Susan hadn't touched a thing, because touching it meant accepting that he wouldn't be back. The echo of his voice still clung to the rafters, woven into the grain of the wood and the creak of the old lift. "You hire me, you pay me fair, and I do this the right way." That had been his line, his only condition, and she had. But somewhere along the way it had stopped being about the job, and she hadn't told him. Not when it mattered, not when he needed to hear it most. She paced slowly, every step a reminder of the distance she'd let grow between them, between what she felt and what she could admit. She'd been so afraid of needing someone, of being vulnerable again, that she'd clung to control like it could save her. But Daniel never wanted control. He wanted truth. She stopped at the bay doors, staring out at the sidewalk where his truck used to park, always a few inches crooked. That little imperfection had driven her nuts in the beginning. Now she missed it like breath. He hadn't just restored the garage, he'd restored her, the part that believed in good people, in starting over, in second chances. And now he was gone, not because he wanted to be, but because she hadn't been brave enough to ask him to stay. And that was the part that hurt the most. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze, a deep red slash across the freshly painted entrance of Sinclair Automotive. The crowd gathered in front clapped politely, their winter coats rustling, breath visible in the cold morning air. Cameras flashed. A local news anchor asked her to smile. Susan did. But it didn't reach her eyes. The garage gleamed behind her, pristine and reborn. New lift, new signage, polished concrete floors that still smelled faintly of varnish. Everything her father had once built had been stripped down, rebuilt, modernized, efficient, clean, impressive. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like a ghost had followed her there. One with calloused hands, soft eyes, and a voice that never filled space unless it had something worth saying. She stood in front of the crowd, scissors poised for the ceremonial cut, and glanced at the space beside her. Empty. Daniel should have been here. She remembered the way he'd run his fingers along the beams when they first stepped inside, how he'd seen past the dust and the cracks. He'd seen the bones. He'd brought the place back to life with grit and quiet devotion. And not a single person in that crowd clapping now had any idea how much of him was in these walls. Susan cut the ribbon. The crowd applauded. The mayor said something about legacy and revitalization. Her assistant handed her a microphone. She cleared her throat. "This garage was built by my father," she began. "He poured everything into it, his pride, his time, his name, and for a long time I wasn't sure what to do with that legacy." She looked out at the crowd and hesitated. "But someone came along and reminded me that legacy isn't about buildings or money. It's about honesty, work, showing up when it matters." No one knew she wasn't talking about her father. She was talking about the man who wasn't there. "I hope this place continues to stand for something more than just service. I hope it stands for second chances." They clapped again. She smiled because it was expected. But inside something folded small and quiet in her chest. The garage was open, but the space that mattered most? Still empty. The envelope was small and lopsided, addressed in shaky, oversized letters. It had been slipped under the loft door sometime that morning, unnoticed until Susan nearly stepped on it carrying in paperwork from the garage. She bent down slowly, her name scrawled in purple marker across the front. No return address, just Susan. Her hand stilled. She knew that handwriting. She sat on the edge of the couch, heart thudding as she unfolded the lined notebook paper, inside. A few dried petals fell out, wildflowers, pressed between pages, crushed, delicate. A child's version of care. The letter read, "Hi, Susan. I hope you're okay. My dad said sometimes people don't say what they mean until it's too late." He didn't say it angry. He said it like when you drop something special and try not to cry. I saw his face when we left. It was different, not mad, just sad, the kind that sticks. I think his heart broke. I think yours did too. Thank you for the best birthday I ever had. Thank you for drawing the flags with me. And thank you for making him laugh again. I didn't hear that laugh for a long time. Not really. You made our world feel big again. I hope you come back into it. Love, Emily. Susan didn't realize she was crying until a tear slipped onto the page, warping the ink. She stared at the words like they were some kind of spell, simple, honest, a little crooked around the edges, exactly like the girl who wrote them. The ache she'd been holding in her chest cracked open. She hadn't just lost Daniel. She'd lost them, and in their place she'd built silence and polished speeches. Pride had bought her a grand opening and a hollow victory. But this letter, this child's truth, was something else entirely. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't logic, it was love, and it was her wake-up call. The boardroom buzzed with quiet intensity, the kind that came from too many suits and not enough heart. Charts glowed on the screen at the head of the long glass table, projections, forecasts, clean lines marching toward controlled, profitable futures. Susan sat at the front, blazer crisp, hair pulled back, nodding in all the right places. She should have felt powerful. Instead, her pulse was somewhere else. Back in a loft that felt too still without laughter. Back in a garage filled with echoes. Back in a child's letter that now lived folded in her purse, soft from too many rereadings. And if we continue along the current growth curve, we anticipate a 10-point gain by next quarter, one of the analysts said, his laser pointer hovering over a bar graph like it mattered. Susan stared at the numbers. They meant nothing. Her fingers twitched in her lap. She could still see Emily's messy handwriting. "You made our world feel big again." It had gutted her, that line, because she remembered what it felt like to live small, guarded, alone. She stood up mid-sentence. The room fell silent. "Apologies," she said, reaching for her bag. "I need to leave." A few board members blinked. One cleared his throat. "Susan, we still have the quarterly strategy." "I'm aware," she said, already walking toward the door. "And I'm telling you now, I've got something more important." They didn't stop her. No one followed. They wouldn't understand. Not until the next headline hit, Sinclair heiress. Walks out of the meeting for mystery trip. Let them guess. The city blurred past as she drove, faster than she should have, hands tight on the wheel. She didn't know what she was going to say when she got there. She only knew she couldn't not say it anymore. She reached Maple Ridge just as the sun began to dip, painting the small town in gold and pink. Familiar, humble, honest. She parked outside Daniel's shop, the same crooked angle he always used. Her heart thundered as she stepped out. This wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It was about chasing what mattered, and this time she wasn't turning back. The scent of motor oil hit her the second she stepped inside. The same blend of rust, heat, and grit that had clung to Daniel like a second skin. The overhead lights buzzed dimly, one flickering in the corner, and the familiar creak of a socket wrench echoed from beneath a truck in the far bay. Susan stood in the doorway for a moment, her breath catching. It was all so him, no polish, no presentation, just work and purpose and quiet persistence. Daniel slid out from under the truck, grease on his hands, shirt clinging to his back. He wiped his face with the edge of his sleeve, then froze when he saw her. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in the way people look when they're not sure if they're dreaming. "What are you doing here?" he asked, sitting up. Susan stepped forward, heart pounding. "I left the meeting." He gave a short laugh, dry and disbelieving. "You left the boardroom to come here?" "I walked out." she said, voice trembling but steady. Because none of it mattered. Not the numbers, not the forecasts, not when I knew what I was losing. Daniel stood slowly, arms crossed, guarded. You could have called. I didn't want to call, she said, meeting his gaze. I wanted to show up. You said something that stuck with me. You said, I froze when you needed me to reach back. And you were right. He didn't move. I've spent so much of my life trying to be bulletproof, she continued. I've been taught to lead with control, to protect the brand, to always, always stay ahead of emotion. But that's not who I want to be anymore. She stepped closer, hands open. I want to be the kind of person who tells the truth, who fights for what's real. And what's real is you, Daniel, you and Emily. What we built in that garage, it wasn't just a restoration project. It was a second chance for me. Silence stretched between them. Then Daniel let out a long breath, his shoulders easing just a little. You really walked out of a board meeting for this? Susan smiled, eyes glistening. You're worth walking out for. And finally, he stepped forward. Not to argue, not to ask questions, but to pull her into his arms. They sat on the back steps of Daniel's shop, the night folding in around them. The stars above Maple Ridge were softer than the city skyline. Fewer lights, less noise, and somehow more truth. Crickets hummed in the tall grass. A breeze stirred the trees. Everything felt stripped down and honest, like the rest of the world had taken a step back to give them room. Daniel held a mug of coffee between his hands, the steam curling toward the sky. Susan sat beside him, legs tucked beneath her, a blanket draped over her shoulders like a shield she didn't really need anymore. They hadn't spoken in a while, not since the hug, not since the silence that followed, but there was no tension, just waiting. Finally, Daniel broke it. You scared me. She nodded slowly. I scared myself. He glanced at her, then back at the field. I'm not used to people staying. I know, she said quietly. I'm not used to letting them. He turned the mug in his hands. You could have had anyone. Someone easier. Someone who didn't come with history, with a daughter and a busted truck and a shop that barely breaks even. Susan smiled faintly. You think that's what I want? Daniel didn't answer. I've had easier, she continued. I've had clean-cut, PR-friendly, just-for-show kind of men. They all looked great on paper, but none of them ever made me feel seen, not like you. He looked at her then, really looked. She went on, voice soft but steady. I was afraid of what it meant to need someone. Afraid that admitting I care made me weak. But walking into that boardroom the day after you left, I felt hollow, like I'd traded real life for a polished version of it. Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee. And now? I want the real thing, she said, even if it's messy, even if it's hard. He leaned back on his elbows, exhaling. I'm not always good at this. Me either. But I'm trying, he said, every day. For Emily, for me, and maybe now, for us. Susan reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. That's all I've ever needed. No business plans, no strategy decks, just two people, no armor, sitting under a small-town sky, finally unafraid to be seen. It was the beginning of something real. The next morning broke quiet and golden, the kind of light that slipped gently through the blinds and made everything look softer than it was the day before. Daniel stood at the counter of the shop office, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs, his hands moving with the easy rhythm of someone who finally didn't have to brace for bad news. Susan leaned in the doorway, watching him with a half-smile tugging at her lips. The denim shirt he wore was frayed at the collar. The coffee machine hissed like an old friend. And for the first time in years, she felt grounded, not in her schedule, not in numbers or deals, but in this. Can I steal a second of your time, Mr. Carter? She said playfully. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. You already stole my toolbox, my lift, and my sleep. Might as well. She walked in, closing the distance slowly. Her expression shifted, gentling, as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. Not glossy, not corporate, just paper. Personal. He raised an eyebrow as she handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked. "Read it." Daniel opened the envelope and pulled out a single-page agreement. Nothing flashy. His name. Her name. The Sinclair Garage logo at the top, but the title across the top made his breath catch. Co-ownership agreement. He looked up. "Susan, I'm not offering you a favor," she interrupted, voice steady. "This isn't a safety net. It's not a thank you gift. I'm offering you a partnership." He searched her face. "You don't have to do this." "I want to do this," she said. "Because this garage, it's not just mine anymore. You rebuilt it. Not just the walls, but the heart of it. And if we're going to keep building, I don't want to do it alone." Daniel stared down at the paper again, heart thudding somewhere between disbelief and something dangerously close to joy. "I never asked for this," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I trust you with it." He folded the paper slowly, tucked it into his back pocket. Then he looked at her, really looked, and gave a nod that said more than any signature ever could. "Then let's build something worth keeping." The house wasn't big. It didn't have a grand staircase or marble countertops, no sweeping city views or staff behind every door. Just 3 bedrooms, an old porch that creaked when you walked across it, and a maple tree in the front yard that dropped golden leaves like confetti in the fall. But it felt different the moment Daniel unlocked the door and stepped inside, Susan and Emily right behind him. There were still boxes stacked in corners. The kitchen needed a fresh coat of paint. The back fence leaned slightly to one side. But when Emily ran through the hallway, laughing, her footsteps echoing like music in the open space, Daniel felt something in his chest settle, something that hadn't settled in years. "Can I paint my room purple?" Emily shouted from down the hall. Susan looked at Daniel with a grin. "She's clearly made herself at home." Daniel smiled. "Purple it is." They spent the day unpacking the essentials: blankets, dishes, Emily's growing collection of sketchbooks. Susan found a spot near the window for a worn little plant Daniel had stubbornly kept alive through 3 winters. She didn't say anything about its drooping leaves. She just placed it in the sun. Later, as twilight fell and the scent of something warm baking in the oven drifted through the house, thanks to Susan's growing obsession with cinnamon rolls, Daniel stepped out onto the porch. The light from the living room spilled through the screen door behind him. Inside, Emily was drawing. Susan was humming as she set the table. He sat on the steps, breathed in the cool air, and stared out at the quiet street. The garage was just a few blocks away, close enough to walk, far enough to keep work and home separate, something he never thought he'd have the luxury to consider. This place wasn't just a roof. It wasn't temporary or built out of necessity. It was theirs. Susan joined him a moment later, slipping her hand into his. "No boardrooms," she murmured. "No engines to fix," he added. "Just this." He nodded, heart full. After years of holding everything together, of surviving in pieces, they'd finally found a place where all the pieces fit. Home. The late afternoon sun bathed the front yard in honeyed light, casting long shadows across the porch and catching in the curls of Emily's hair as she danced barefoot in the grass. A ribbon trailed from her hand like a kite, twirling behind her in spirals of red and gold. Her laughter rang out, clear and wild, as she spun in circles, not for anyone's applause, just because it felt good to be free. Daniel sat on the porch steps, one knee up, a cold lemonade sweating in his hand. He watched her with the easy pride of a man who knew how close he'd come to losing moments like this. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, grease still smudged faintly on his forearm from a quick job at the garage earlier, but for the first time he didn't feel like he was running to catch up to life. Susan sat beside him, barefoot too, her heels abandoned somewhere near the door. Her hair was wind-tossed, and the kind of smile she wore wasn't the polished one she used for cameras or meetings. It was real, effortless, earned. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he shifted just enough to let her in without letting her go. "Is this what you pictured?" she asked, voice soft. Daniel looked out over the yard, Emily doing cartwheels, the garage in the distance, the house glowing behind them. He didn't need to think long. "No," he said. "It's better." Susan smiled, eyes fixed on the little girl who had unknowingly pulled both of them out of their hiding places. A breeze lifted the ribbon from Emily's hand, and it flew higher, catching in a low branch. She shrieked with delight, pointing up as the fabric fluttered like a flag above them. Susan laughed, a full, uninhibited laugh that turned Daniel's head. She wasn't the guarded woman who had once stepped out of a smoking car on the side of a rural road, and he wasn't just a tired mechanic anymore. Something between them had been repaired too, invisible but unshakable. And it had all started with one good deed. The camera would pull back then, if this were a movie. A girl spinning in the grass, a father smiling without weight in his shoulders, and a woman who used to be alone in a tower of glass, now grounded, loved, and laughing beside them. The end. And also the beginning.